Have you ever tried going outside in 22 degrees below zero Fahrenheit weather, wearing thin, tight-fitting trousers and a broadcloth jacket with an open neck? Now, imagine you don't just need to run to the nearest store, but to walk thousands of miles, sleep on frozen ground, carry your gear, and all the while engage in active combat. Our entire lives, we've been lied to about the events of the War of 1812. School textbooks and official historians feed us fairy tales that Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest strategist of his time, allegedly simply forgot to check the calendar and failed to account for the harshness of the Russian winter. Do you really believe that a tactical genius who conquered all of Europe was so foolish as to send a 600,000-strong army into an icy hell dressed in summer dress uniforms? This sounds like the ravings of a madman, yet this is precisely the version sold to us as the ultimate truth. Look closely at the paintings of that era, at the engravings by those who witnessed the events, at the museum exhibits. What do we see? We see absurdity. We see a theater of the absurd, where the actors forgot to change their costumes. Soldiers of both armies, both French and Russian, look as if they gathered for a leisurely stroll along the Champs-Élysées on a warm May day, not for a deadly battle in the snows of Russia. Let's set aside emotions and engage cold logic and physics. The human body is a biological machine that requires maintaining a specific temperature to function. At temperatures of 4 or 22 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, as historical accounts tell us, heat loss in the clothing worn by the soldiers leads to hypothermia within hours. Breeches. Think about that word. Narrow, tight-fitting trousers made of elk leather or thick broadcloth, which were pulled on tightly, often even wet, to dry directly on the body and take the perfect shape of the legs. This is fashion for palace ballrooms, for balls, for showing off to ladies. This is not clothing for war. It is physically impossible to wear this in freezing temperatures. Leather stiffens in the cold, turning into an icy shell that draws the last warmth from muscles. Broadcloth, once wet with snow, turns into an icy crust. And yet, they had no thermal underwear, no synthetic insulation, no membrane fabrics. Official history tells us, well, that was the fashion. Beauty demanded sacrifices. Sacrifices of hundreds of thousands of lives? Are you serious? Did neither Kutuzov nor Napoleon think to provide their soldiers with sheepskin coats, felt boots, and fur hats? Why do generals in all their ceremonial portraits stand in uniforms with open collars, without scarves, wearing thin gloves or none at all? The answer being withheld from us is simultaneously shocking in its simplicity and its horror. They weren't idiots. They were dressed for the weather. Only the weather was completely different. We stand on the brink of a grand revelation about a climactic catastrophe that occurred quite recently by historical standards. Look at the uniforms. Shakos, those tall headwear pieces made of leather and cardboard. They protect against a saber strike, yes, but they are absolutely useless against the cold. Ears are exposed. The back of the neck is exposed. Recall a Russian winter. The first thing you do is cover your ears and neck. Yet here, hundreds of thousands of people are marching with open necks. Calfskin knapsacks, white cross belts that constantly needed to be whitened with chalk. In the conditions of a winter campaign, with mud and soot, it's impossible to keep them clean. But in paintings, we see that this uniform is maintained until the very end. Why are historians silent about the fact that such attire is perfectly suited for the climate of modern Italy or southern France, but by no means for the Smolensk road in November or December? There is a theory that makes academics' hands tremble. The War of 1812 took place under entirely different climatic conditions. It was a war in the subtropics. Or, even more frighteningly, a climatic shock occurred right in the midst of the campaign. Imagine, you set out on a campaign in September when it's 77 degrees Fahrenheit outside, gardens are blooming, and you expect a mild autumn. And suddenly, overnight, the temperature drops to 22 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Not gradually, not over a month, but within mere days or hours. This explains everything. This explains why the great army, perfectly equipped and disciplined, turned into a mob of frozen, ragged people. They didn't forget warm clothing. They didn't need it in the world where they began the war. The world changed instantly. A planetary-scale catastrophe, all mention of which was erased, leaving us only absurd tales about general winter. But let's dig even deeper. Was there even winter at all, in the sense we are accustomed to? Look at the architecture of that period. Huge windows in palaces, an absence of vestibules, gigantic doors. In St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in country estates. How do you propose to heat rooms with 16-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows with wood-burning stoves during a bitter frost? Thermal physics tells us, you can't. You would simply heat the street. So the climate was mild, warm, without extreme sub-zero temperatures. And the soldiers' uniforms perfectly matched this climate. Thin broadcloth uniforms, breeches, and ankle boots are clothing for temperatures no lower than 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything below that is a death sentence for an army in the field. Yet historians continue to tell us about the harsh winter of 1812. Where is the logic? If winters were always so severe, then over centuries of military uniform evolution, it should have come to resemble the gear of Arctic peoples. We should have seen armies in parkas, in fur trousers, in felt boots. But we see European dandies, who, for some reason, decided to fight in waist-deep snowdrifts. Here lies a monstrous substitution of concepts. Either the dates of the war are shifted, and it took place in summer, and we are told about winter to conceal the fact that there was no winter at all then, or a climatic catastrophe, the so-called Little Ice Age, or the year without a summer, occurred precisely at this moment as a result of the use of a weapon unknown to us, or a cosmic event. Think about logistics. Horses. Cavalry was the udarnaya sila, striking force, of that era. The French cavalry numbered tens of thousands of heads. How do you feed horses in winter when everything is covered in snow? With oats that must be carried along? One horse eats an enormous amount of fodder daily. A supply train of hay would have to be several times larger than the army itself. Where are these supply trains in the paintings? They are not there. Horses are grazing. What grass in December near Moscow? We are told they tore roofs off houses, fed them straw. This is nonsense. A war horse will not last long on straw roofs. It will collapse within a week. And they fought for months. This means there was grass. This means there was no snow. This means the entire history of the winter campaign is a later invention, designed to mask something far more terrifying than mere frost. We are approaching the most interesting part. If the climate was different, then why did it change? And why, precisely during this period, did the Earth's population, judging by indirect evidence, sharply decline? We see empty cities in engravings from the early 19th century. Piranesi draws ruins overgrown with bushes, among which rare people in rags wander. These are not just an artist's fantasies. This is a documentary record of a post-apocalypse, and in these settings of a destroyed yet still warm world, two armies clash. They are lightly dressed because just yesterday it was warm here, but suddenly the heavens opened. What was it? A comet impact? The passage of Nibiru? Or the use of technologies we've forgotten? Technologies capable of changing the climate, freezing entire regions. General Winter is not a metaphor. It is a code name for a climatic weapon, or a natural cataclysm that destroyed the Grand Army, and at the same time, wiped ancient civilization off the face of the earth, the remnants of which we today call empire style. Let's take up the microscope of logic and examine seemingly insignificant details that, upon closer inspection, shatter the entire foundation of the official history of the War of 1812. We stopped at clothing, but let's delve deeper into physiology and material science. Breeches, those legendary tight-fitting trousers, were made from processed elk or deer leather. Do you know the thermal conductivity of leather? It's terrible as an insulator, but excellent as a conductor of ambient temperature when stretched tightly against the body. In 22 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, such second skin acts like an ice compress. It constricts capillaries, disrupting blood circulation. Any modern alpinist or polar explorer will tell you that the main rule for survival in the cold is layering and an air gap. Napoleon's and Alexander I's soldiers had no air gap at all. They were vacuum-packed in broadcloth and leather. From a medical standpoint, mass deaths from necrosis of leg tissues should have occurred after 3 days of marching. Not after a month, but after 3 days. The army should have turned into 500,000 legless invalids even before reaching Smolensk, if official weather reports are to be believed. But they march, run, gallop, and even dance at balls. Now look at their footwear. These are not just boots. They are ankle boots with thin soles, often studded with metal nails. Metal is a bridge for cold. In bitter frost, the nails in the sole freeze instantly, transferring cold to the foot. This guarantees frostbite of the toes. But we are told that the French, Italians, Spaniards, southern peoples, genetically unsuited to cold, heroically endured. This is a lie. Physiology cannot be persuaded by patriotism. If the body becomes hypothermic, it shuts down. The conclusion is obvious. They were walking on warm, dry ground, and that is why their footwear had thin soles, so their feet wouldn't get hot. The entire design of military uniforms from the early 19th century is a hymn to ventilation, not thermal insulation. High stand-up collars do not tightly close the throat. They leave a gap. Slits in the tails of the uniform. The absence of mittens. Have you ever tried to load a flintlock rifle with bare hands in 22 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit? Try to grasp a metal ramrod in freezing temperatures. The skin on your fingers will instantly stick to the metal. You can only tear it off along with your flesh. Now, imagine doing this in battle, under fire, every 2 minutes. Tens of thousands of soldiers should have been left without skin on their hands after the very first engagement. But historical chronicles contain no widespread mentions of such injuries. This means the metal was not icy. This means the air was warm. Let's continue. The logistics of warmth. The official version states that the army bivouacked, meaning they slept in the open air or in light tents. 600,000 people. Imagine that number. That's the population of a large regional center suddenly finding itself in an open field in winter. To warm such a mass of people by campfires in extreme sub-zero temperatures, an enormous amount of wood would need to be burned. Mathematical calculations reveal figures that make your hair stand on end. To sustain life, not comfort, but simply life, such a number of people would require clear-cutting about 125 acres of forest daily. During the campaign from the Neman to Moscow and back, they should have left behind a strip of scorched earth dozens of miles wide, where not a single tree, not a single splinter would remain. But in paintings of that era, we see beautiful avenues, entire groves on the battlefields. Where did the firewood come from, esteemed historians? Did they bring it from France? This is absurd. The only explanation is that they did not need to warm themselves by fires around the clock. They were not fighting for survival every night. The climate allowed them to sleep on the ground, covered by a greatcoat, and not wake up dead. Now, let's look underfoot, literally. A topic inextricably linked to climate is the condition of the soil. We know about the so-called buried floors all over the world. Buildings in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, Omsk, and even Paris and Rome are sunk several yards into the ground. We are lied to about the cultural layer. Allegedly, people for centuries didn't clear dirt from the streets, and gradually, houses sank. Do you believe that palace residents walked knee-deep in manure and mud and were so lazy that they simply built new floors on top? No. These are traces of catastrophic soil deposition. A flood, a mudslide, soil falling from the heavens. Call it what you will. And the War of 1812 strangely coincides with this period. What if the snow that memoirists write about was not snow at all? What if it was ash? Or the application of technologies we've forgotten? Technologies capable of altering the climate, freezing entire regions. General Winter is not a metaphor. It is a code name for a climatic weapon or a natural cataclysm that destroyed the Grand Army and, at the same time, wiped ancient civilization off the face of the earth, the remnants of which we today call Empire style. Look at Vereshchagin's paintings dedicated to this war. Yes, they were painted later, but the artist studied the materials. In them, we see strange snowdrifts through which green trees are visible. Green foliage in the snow? Historians will say, artistic license, but we say, documentary evidence of a sharp climate change. The moment when summer turned into winter in 1 hour. The trees didn't have time to shed their leaves. They were frozen solid or covered by an unknown substance. This was not a war of nations. This was a rescue operation, or, conversely, a clearing of territory in the midst of a global catastrophe. Perhaps Napoleon's and Kutuzov's armies didn't fight each other at all in the sense we are presented. Perhaps they jointly tried to save themselves or take control of surviving resources after the old world collapsed, and the battles were skirmishes for food and shelter in a world gone mad with terror. Recall the burning of Moscow. We are told, the Russians themselves burned their ancient capital so it wouldn't fall to the enemy, and Napoleon sat in the Kremlin and watched the fire. But allow me, stone buildings don't burn so intensely that bricks melt. Yet in Moscow there is evidence of melted stone. The combustion temperature in an ordinary fire does not reach such values. This resembles a pinpoint strike with a high-tech weapon. And this strike could have been the trigger for climate change. Nuclear winter, a term from the 20th century, but a phenomenon possibly from the 19th. The release of a huge amount of soot and dust into the atmosphere blocked the sun. The temperature plummeted, and it was then that light breeches and beautiful shakos became a deadly trap. Armies entered a flourishing land and found themselves in an icy desert. They were not fools who forgot their fur coats. They were victims of a planetary-scale force majeure. And one more fact that gives pause. Where are the mass graves of hundreds of thousands of soldiers? According to official data, over 500,000 people died. Where are their bones? The fields near Borodino should be strewn with skeletons. Archaeologists find buttons, buckles, cannonballs. But where are the skeletons? There are remarkably few. What happened to the biomass of 500,000 bodies? If they froze, they should have lain there until spring. They should have been buried in massive mass graves. These graves do not exist in the quantity that corresponds to the losses. This can only mean one thing. Either the army numbers are exaggerated tenfold, and the entire war was a local skirmish inflated to epic proportions by propaganda, or the bodies were destroyed by something else. Atomized? Burned in flames whose temperature turns bones to ash? Or perhaps washed away by the very torrent of mud that buried the ground floors of buildings across Eurasia? We approach a terrifying thought. The history of 1812 is a screen. A beautiful, heroic screen with hussars and emperors painted over a terrifying picture of the demise of a civilization. We are told about tactics and strategy so that we don't ask questions about climate and technology. Why do the uniforms of that era so resemble ancient armor, only made of fabric? Epaulets resembling shoulder pads, cuirasses, helmets with crests. This is a cargo cult, an imitation of ancient protective technologies whose meaning had been lost. They wore uniforms that copied the protective suits of the past, but no longer possessed their properties. And when the real frost struck, artificial or natural, this theatrical prop did not save them. Let's for a moment step away from the climate and look at the participants in this deadly spectacle. Have you ever placed side-by-side images of a Russian and a French soldier from 1812? Remove the uniform colors, forget the flags. What do you see? You see twins. Identical cut, identical shakos, identical epaulets, identical knapsacks, identical weapons. We are told that fashion was like that, pan-European. But allow me. During wartime, when the survival of a nation is at stake, no one thinks about fashion. They think about distinguishing friend from foe. In the smoke of battle, in the chaos of hand-to-hand combat, how do you distinguish your soldier in a blue uniform from an enemy in dark green if both are covered in mud, soot, and blood? The silhouettes are identical. This contradicts all laws of military psychology and tactics. The only logical explanation for this frightening unification is that this was not a war between different states. It was a civil war within one global empire, an empire that encompassed all of Europe and parts of Asia. The empire style that predominated then is not called Imperial for nothing. It was the style of a unified ancient civilization that was living its last days before it was wiped off the face of the earth, and history was rewritten, dividing a single people into warring nations. Look at the maps of that time. Strange inconsistencies in borders, names of cities that have disappeared, rivers that flow in the wrong direction. And most importantly, the purpose of Napoleon's campaign. Why did he go to Moscow? The capital of the Russian Empire was St. Petersburg. The Tsar resided there, as did the court, ministries, treasury, and fleet. Any strategist wishing to defeat a country strikes at the head, the capital. A strike on St. Petersburg would have been deadly and swift. It was closer to go from the border to St. Petersburg, the roads were better, and sea supply was easier. But Napoleon, this supposed genius, turns an armada and goes deep into the continent, to the old capital, which, according to the official version, was a large merchant city, mostly wooden. Where is the logic? There is no logic if you believe the textbooks, but everything falls into place if we admit the existence of Great Tartary. Moscow was not just a city, it was a border outpost, or even the capital of that other Russia, Muscovite Tartary, about which we are forbidden to know. Napoleon and Alexander I might not have been enemies at all, but allies. The United Army of Europe and pro-Western St. Petersburg was going to suppress the East. It was going to destroy the remnants of the old horde, in the good sense of the word horde as order, civilization. And here, climate and that very frost come into play. Perhaps the defenders of Tartary used a doomsday weapon. Or did nature itself rebel against this invasion? Let's return to the physics of survival. We talked about calories. A soldier on campaign expends 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day. In freezing temperatures, this figure rises to 6,000 to 7,000 as the body expends colossal energy on heating. What were the soldiers fed? Hardtack, porridge, sometimes meat. To get 6,000 calories from hardtack, one would need to eat several pounds of it. This is physically impossible to digest while marching. They didn't have energy bars or sports nutrition. In conditions of winter cold and meager rations described in memoirs, the army should have perished from starvation, alimentary dystrophy, within 2 weeks. Not from bullets, but because the soldiers' hearts would simply stop from lack of energy. But they fought, dragged cannons, built bridges in icy water. This means there was no cold. Or the supply was completely different, using food preservation and synthesis technologies that were lost after the catastrophe. By the way, about canned food. It is officially believed that Nicolas Appert invented canned food precisely for Napoleon's army in 1810. Glass, boiling, airtightness. But widespread use, as we are told, they did not find. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps we see millions of empty tin cans on the battlefields, which later rotted away? No. We see a strange emptiness. The infrastructure of that war raises more questions than answers. Roads. The famous Old Smolensk Road. What was it? A dirt track? In the muddy season, autumn and spring, heavy artillery could not pass over a dirt track. Wheels would sink up to the hub. 600,000 people would turn any road into a muddy mess within an hour of passing. But the army moved quickly. The speed of Napoleon's troops' movement is phenomenal, even for motorized units of the 20th century. They covered vast distances on foot. This is possible only in one case, if there were solid, high-quality imperial roads, with hard surfacing underfoot. Those very roads of ancient civilization, the remnants of which we sometimes find under layers of asphalt or in forests, in the form of strange paved tracks leading nowhere. And now, recall the officers' notes. Many participants in the campaign, in their diaries, write not about frost, but about rain and mud in December. Rain in December near Moscow? This is direct evidence that the climate was subtropical, and the sharp cold snap, that very general winter, struck suddenly when there was no longer anywhere to retreat. It was a climatic trap. Who sprung it? Higher powers? Or those who managed the process of the Great Reset? Imagine 2 enormous armies, the best gene pools of their nations, gathered at one point. The ideal moment to eliminate in one blow the passionate individuals capable of resisting the new world order. They were lured deep into the continent, given the illusion of an easy stroll in warm weather, and then, with the push of a button or the initiation of a single process, the heating was turned off across the entire planet. The temperature plummeted, and the greatest army in history turned into icy statues. Note the demographic gaps. After the War of 1812, the population of Europe and Russia recovered suspiciously slowly. We are told about war losses, but losses, even of 500,000, cannot halt demographic growth for decades. This is only possible if not 500,000, but tens of millions died. If the war was merely an episode of a global cataclysm that destroyed cities and villages, we look at maps of that time and see a dense network of settlements. But on maps from the mid-19th century, there is a desert. Where did thousands of villages go? Were they burned by the French? They didn't have that many torches or that much time. They marched in a narrow strip. Villages disappeared, along with their inhabitants, due to something that covered vast territories. And those who survived, that is us, the descendants of the few who endured in cellars or on high ground. We are a civilization of orphans who forgot their parents and put on their clothes without understanding their purpose. The oddities continue in medicine. Surgeon Leray, Napoleon's personal physician, allegedly performed hundreds of amputations in field conditions, without anesthesia, without antibiotics, in freezing temperatures. Survival rates after such operations in unsanitary conditions tend towards 0. Gangrene, sepsis, shock. But in reports, miraculous healings. Is this a lie, or do we not know the level of their medicine? Perhaps they had means of regeneration, or powerful antiseptics, the secret of which vanished with the Golden Age. And amputations were not a consequence of cannonball wounds, but an attempt to save people from the effects of radiation sickness or chemical burns. The ulcers described in soldiers are very similar to the consequences of radiation damage: hair loss, tooth loss, weakness. Historians attribute this to scurvy and bad water, but scurvy does not develop in a couple of weeks. It is a prolonged process of avitaminosis. But here, people fell ill instantly. And finally, the most important question of this section. Why is there a triumphal arch in Paris in honor of Napoleon's victories, and in St. Petersburg, Alexander Column and arches in honor of the victory over Napoleon? In both places, triumph. In both places, ancient symbolism. No Orthodox crosses, no Christian symbols on the main monuments of the war. Only Roman eagles, goddesses of Nike, laurel wreaths. These are monuments to the same culture. The victory was not one country over another. It was the victory of a third force over humanity. Or perhaps a fixed match in which ordinary people lost, frozen in summer breeches in the midst of a suddenly arrived nuclear winter. We celebrate victory, not understanding that what we are actually commemorating is the day of a great sacrifice. You should be seized by a feeling of deep indignation. We have not just been deceived, we have been cynically deprived of the memory of our true past. Look at those breeches and thin uniforms once more. This is not the military attire of short-sighted commanders. These are the everyday clothes of people who physically did not know what frost was. They lived in a world where eternal summer allowed them to wear thin broadcloth year-round. All this glittering tinsel, golden epaulets, tall plumes, is, in essence, the carnival costumes of a perished great civilization, hastily adapted by the survivors for a bloody slaughter. We look at old parades and think of the grandeur of empires, but we should see the tragedy of people wearing the cast-off clothes of gods. Imagine the primal terror of a person who wakes up in the subtropics in the morning, and by evening, their world is forever buried in snow. Birds fall like frozen stones. Water turns to ice mid-air. What we call the Patriotic War of 1812 is not a strategic confrontation of nations. It is an agony. It is the struggle of crowds driven mad by fear for the last crumbs of food in a rapidly cooling world. The French and Russians killed each other not for an emperor, but for a warm basement and a sack of grain. And historians, those loyal guardians of the Matrix, tidied up this bloody chaos. They put pretty labels on frozen corpses and concocted a fairy tale about tactics to conceal the fact of a global territorial cleansing. We are the descendants of those who miraculously survived this climatic meat grinder. We consider winter normal, but our bodies, dying without clothes in an hour, scream the opposite. We are a tropical species, trapped in an icy prison. The entire history of the 19th century is a convulsive attempt to adapt to a hostile environment. We build thick walls, burn the Earth's interior, but looking at hussars in tight breeches, we feel a phantom pain. A memory of a time when the world was unified, warm, and safe. We have been convinced that we always lived in dirt and cold, but this is a blatant lie. We were driven out of a climatic paradise, our memory erased by an icy wind, and the War of 1812 became merely a cruel facade for the great reformatting of humanity into an obedient herd, solely occupied with survival. History is cyclical. What happened 200 years ago can repeat itself. Preparations for a new reset are in full swing. We are again being told about climate change, about the need to reduce consumption, about new threats. The scenario is the same, only the scenery changes. But now we are armed with knowledge. We know that breaches and freezing temperatures are a lie, and therefore, everything else might also be an illusion. They want you to sleep. They want you to think that history is a collection of random dates, but you now know history is a weapon. And the War of 1812 is not over. It continues in our minds. It is a war for the right to know who we are, where we came from, and why we are so cold in this world. Do not let yourself be deceived again. Seek the truth, even if it frightens you, because only the truth can melt the ice that has encased our memory.